This is St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, where I almost went to school. I thought very seriously about going to college here. I ended up not going to college at all. I grew up homeschooled from first grade all the way through 12th, so I was very comfortable with being different, but I always expected that I was going to be going to college. I was a very academic kid. I loved school. And so everybody just assumed, well, if you do well in school, you go to college, and I assumed so too. But I remember the day when the veneer of college began to crack. I was 15 years old, and my mom and I went to a college planning night at my local high school. And we attended a session on paying for college because, as you may have heard, college is expensive. And so I thought, well, this probably would be a prudent thing to start preparing for. And I expected to be learning about how to apply for scholarships and how to apply for college loans. What I did not expect to learn was this stat, which is weirdly a little butchered. It didn't look like that when I exported it, guys. 1 in 7 is what the top thing is supposed to read. American college graduates default on their loans. 47% of American college graduates are in debt, and 52% of American college graduates do not work in the field they studied in. I was a little horrified by this, and I came home and I remember telling my mom, it kind of sounds like a really bad thing for this to be the very first adult decision I'll ever make, is to go into debt and spend tons of money on a degree that I don't need. Because I was slowly realizing that I didn't really want to work in any field that traditionally required having a college degree. I was already getting an education that was very curated to my needs and interests as a homeschooler. And so when college application season came around, I didn't even apply at all. My extended family was horrified. They thought that I was throwing my potential away, that I was ruining my life by not taking the path I was supposed to be on. And there was a very big part of me that was afraid they were right. I graduated from high school in 2015. This was a couple years before the big slew of articles started coming out in all the major publications about whether or not a degree is a good idea and the financial crisis that college graduates were in. So it was kind of uncharted territory, and I was very scared that I was making the wrong decision. But I did the personal calculus, and I was like, okay, the worst case scenario here is that I'll have to go to college later. Like, if I'm totally miscalculated, if I'm getting this wrong, college will still be there, and I might be a little unhappy from an ego standpoint that I'm the oldest person in the classroom when I start college, but I can still go. I can handle this. I can deal with the repercussions if I'm wrong. So I took the leap. This is me working for a startup where I landed a job right out of high school. It was a college apprenticeship program called Praxis that was helping people skip college and go work in the business world, which seemed like a good place to figure out how to be successful without a college degree. I built a career. I built businesses since, but everybody told me I was crazy. Even when I was working a real job without a college degree, people thought I was crazy. It took some people years to realize that maybe I was going to be okay. Part of this is because we spend our whole lives being told to follow the rules. It's one of the biggest lessons we learn in school. School teaches us things like math and reading and writing, but really what it's teaching us is to stand in line and wait your turn and raise your hand if you have a question. So the impulse to follow rules is baked very deep in us, and it begins at a very early age. And we want to follow the rules because we're social creatures. We want to get along with other people. We want to have friends. We want to be liked. And we think that being liked is part of what's necessary for being successful in life. We all, at the end of the day, we just want to be happy. We want to be successful at life. We want to have some money. We want to be able to sustain ourselves. We want to have meaningful relationships. We want to have a meaningful career. And all of these are noble goals. They're very good things to be striving for. They're the underpinnings of a good life. But we think that following rules are the best path forward to attain these things, because that's what we've always been told. If you get good grades, you'll get into a good college. If you get into a good college, you'll get a good job. If you get a good job, you'll find a good spouse. If you find a good spouse, you'll have a good family. You can live in a nice house. You can be happy. And we think that part of attaining these things requires social approval. We think we have to be socially successful in order to get these things. Someone else is a gatekeeper for every single one of these steps along the path. But not all people's approval is worth having. Some people's opinions are helpful. Many other people's opinions are not. And you don't need everyone's approval in order to be successful in life. But nobody tells you this when you're a kid who's getting in trouble for breaking the rules, and you maybe get yelled at and you're a little embarrassed, or you have to sit in the corner. It's very scary to have adults tell you that you're wrong and that you're being bad. And so most of us learn to fear rule breaking. When you're scared of breaking rules, you're also scared of this thing we call society. What will society think? Society will judge you if you don't do the right things. But society isn't real. Society is a collection of lots of people, but it's just people. Society itself doesn't have thoughts or emotions or opinions. It's just a collective of individual people with individual ideas. There are institutions of society, things like schools, companies, governments, and social institutions do have rules. They like rules. Institutions love rules because rules help keep things organized, and an institution requires some level of organization in order to function. But society, this thing, is just the monster under the bed. It's not real. It's just an abstraction. It's a way of thinking. It's a tool for thinking, and sometimes it's useful. But it's not something you have to be afraid of, and it doesn't have this all-consuming power over the trajectory of your life, and you have to appease it in order to be okay. But nobody tells you that when you're a child who's getting in trouble, and you're afraid because you think you're going to ruin your life if you break the wrong rules. So you learn to be a rule follower. Okay, this all requires a little bit of definition, and some of these slides are a little, this was centered when I made this, but that's okay, you can pretend. What are rules, and why are they important to follow? There are, wow, okay, this got really, okay, well, the slides aren't following rules either, guys. This is Exhibit A. We're just gonna roll with it. So there are different types of rules. I think you can think of it as kind of 4 big buckets of types of rules that you can think about, ways that you can divide rules. The first are rules of nature. So when Isaac Newton was sitting under the apple tree and he watched an apple fall and he had this grand epiphany about what the laws of physics, he was observing a rule of nature. Rules of nature do not change. They are fixed. And so we must abide by them. Our understanding of these rules might change, but the rules themselves don't change. They are static. And we don't really have free will to break them. They just kind of are. But then there are all of the rules that you have free will to break, unless, you believe that the fates are real and they're spinning a thread of your life for you and you don't ever get to make any of choices and it's all decided for you. You have free will, so you get to choose which rules you would like to break. Among the rules that you can break, we've got another very rule-breaking slide happening here. You have rules of law. Rules of law are constructed by the government. They are rules, there are repercussions for breaking. The consequences are often quite steep. Court, fines, jail time, not really recommended. Then there are rules of morality. Again, the rules of breaking these rules are also quite steep. You pay the cost of your reputation, your character, your own self-esteem. It doesn't feel good to lie or to steal. It does something to your character that's not desirable. It doesn't usually make you feel good as a person. There's a great movie about this. It's called Queen Pins. It came out in 2021. It's based on a true story. It's about 2 women who start an illegal coupon resale business. They figured out how to get coupons for free products, and then they sold them at like half the price of the actual product in store. They sold these coupons online. They made millions of dollars doing this. This really happened. In the movie, there's a quote. The main character, the one on the left, says, "You know who gets rewarded? People who don't follow rules." Except these women got arrested, which I would not really consider a reward. They cost companies millions of dollars with their fraudulent coupon sales. They were breaking both legal and moral rules. They were stealing other people's property. They were infringing on other people's rights. That's not the kind of rule breaking I'm talking about, to be very clear. But there are also lots of rules that appear to be laws and aren't actually that important, and we break them all the time. Sometimes it goes poorly. Usually it's fine. And sometimes laws and morality don't intersect. Sometimes something is a law and it's actually immoral, and you have to make a decision between which one you want to stand by. This is Martin Luther King Jr., who I think is a phenomenal example of someone who questioned the laws of the legal system and also the rules of morality. I don't generally advocate for breaking laws or rules of morality, but sometimes it is a gray area. Sometimes these things don't overlap with your own personal moral code as you start to dig into the philosophy of how you want to live a life and what is important to you. But then there are social rules, and these are the ones that I really want to talk about, because social rules are really social conventions. We think they're rules, but often they're not actually rules at all. This is a very cliche but potent example. Women, for much of recent history, wore corsets. They were highly uncomfortable, I am told. I've never put one on. It sounds terrible. If we were here 150 years ago, Atlanta's very hot right now, we would not have air conditioning. But many of the women would be wearing corsets in spite of the fact that it would have been miserable. Why? Because social convention. Because society says so. Pesky society again, judging you for not doing the right thing. College is another great example of social convention. What I was doing when I decided not to go to college was I was breaking a social rule. I was breaking a social convention about what you are supposed to do. And people told me that I was ruining my life by not going to school. People will tell you that you're ruining your life if you're not going to college, that a college degree is the only way to be successful in life. But that's not true. It's not actually a rule. It just looks like one. This is me not following social conventions. Look at all that wasted potential up there. This was a couple of years into my startup job. I was making $40,000 a year instead of spending $40,000 a year to buy into having a job someday in the future once I finished all of my studies. This is what I was supposed to be doing. I was supposed to be getting a college degree. Society will tell you that you need a degree in order to be successful in life, and it's not true. Even jobs that say degree required don't actually mean it. There are some fields that do actually require a degree, things like being a teacher or being a lawyer or being a doctor. The government thinks that it needs to protect you from people like this, so it hyper-regulates these fields. I'm not particularly a fan of that either, but that is the topic for another talk. But even with these types of things, there are still exceptions. If you want to carve your own path and you say, I want to work in law, but I don't want to get a law degree, there are still things you can do. There are 4 states in America, Washington, Virginia, California, and Vermont, that don't actually require you to have a law degree in order to take the bar exam. So you actually can be a lawyer in some places without having a college degree. If you want to work in education, there are lots of things that you can do if you don't want to take the traditional path, you don't want to go to a college of education and become certified as a teacher. Montessori schools, which is what this is a photograph of, have their own training program that you can go through, and it doesn't require having a degree in education as a prerequisite for getting in. So you can go through a Montessori training program, which is usually infinitely cheaper than going to education school, as opposed to going into a college of education. You can work full-time as a tutor and work with kids and not have a degree. You can be an entrepreneur who builds a school or a network of schools or innovates in the field of education. I work in education. I run a media business that helps parents find options for their kids besides public school, and I don't have a degree at all. But for most of the roles that companies are hiring for that they say degree required, you don't actually have to have a degree in order to apply for them or in order to do the job. Very little of what you're doing on the job actually has anything to do with having a college degree. So why is it that most jobs say degree required? And why do we all just assume that's the way that it has to be? What's going on? Hiring managers really care about your ability to do a good job. They care about whether or not you're going to show up to work on time. They care about whether or not you're going to be diligent about paying attention to detail and making sure you're completing your tasks. They want to know if you actually have the skills required to do the things that you're going to do in your job. But hiring managers are also very busy, and they often receive hundreds of applications when they open up a new job posting. So they use college degree required as a proxy. They're using it as a filtration mechanism, and they're outsourcing their filtration to college admissions boards. They're operating under the assumption that if you were smart enough to get into college and committed enough to finish, and you were willing to do all the uncomfortable things that are required to get a degree, then you'll probably be able to apply all of those things to your job, too. This is outsourced thinking, which as a sidebar is a very sloppy way of thinking, and it's kind of at the crux of what I'm hoping to get across in this talk. Learning to think independently so you can make your own decisions and your own choices about what matters to you that are aligned with yourself, not what someone else has decided for you, is the whole point of what we're getting at here. And this is a great example of outsourcing your thinking, which happens quite a bit in the world around us. But hiring managers are busy, and they can only spend their time on so many things. And so they're looking for shortcuts to be more efficient in their hiring process. And so one of the things that's really easy to filter for is whether or not a student has a college degree. They don't actually care about whether or not you have a degree. It doesn't really have anything to do with what you're doing in your job, probably. They just care about whether or not you'll be able to do your job well. There are lots of famous examples of people who skipped college or who dropped out that get touted frequently. This is Mark Zuckerberg, who dropped out of college after he started Facebook. On the right is Steve Jobs, who actually, despite the sort of like urban legend, did not drop out of college to start Apple. He dropped out of college because his family was broke and they couldn't pay for the tuition. And then he started Apple afterwards, completely unrelated. Well, probably related, but like not really. It wasn't like a 1-2 punch. This is Laura Deming, a little bit less familiar to probably most of you. She dropped out of MIT and is the founder of a VC firm called Longevity Fund. People hate these examples when I bring them up. I tweet about this a lot, actually. There are lots of examples of people who weren't go to college and were successful and like, oh, you mean Steve Jobs? Not everybody's going to be Steve Jobs. This is bad advice. People seem to think that there's this sort of bell curve that if you're going to skip college, you're either going to be a billionaire or you're going to be homeless, and everybody in between has a college degree. True story, but that's not actually how the world works. There are lots of people who are very successful without college degrees in all sorts of ways. This is Lolita Allgaier. She's at this conference. You'll get to perhaps meet her over the course of this weekend. Lolita skipped college. She works as a copywriter. She works as a coach for copywriters. She's coached hundreds of people into becoming copywriters with the largest copywriter accelerator in the world. Lolita didn't go to college at all. She didn't get a degree. She got into this field of work by building a portfolio. She realized that she loved marketing and she loved writing, so she started landing work doing marketing projects. She wrote blog posts. She wrote LinkedIn posts. She built up a portfolio. And she also built a network. And over time, she used that network to land jobs that were more and more aligned with the type of work that she wanted to do, until eventually she landed a role as not just a copywriter, but a coach of other copywriters, which is perhaps the ultimate mark that you've learned something in a field if you're being paid to teach it to someone else. Society would have told Lolita that the only way to be successful would be to go to school for copywriting, which clearly wasn't true. Lolita is a great example of that. I want to be very clear, though. Not all social conventions are bad. I don't want to come up here and say that even most social conventions are bad. A lot of the rules of society exist for a reason, and they're good reasons. But you might not think it's a good reason for you, and that's the distinction. you're likely going to want to follow many social conventions. You might want to take a normal career path. You might want to take a normal education path. You might want to get married in a very traditional wedding and have children and raise your family in a very traditional way, and all of that is okay and all of that is good. I want to live a life that has many social conventions too. The difference, the point, is not to reject rules entirely. It's to choose the ones you want to follow deliberately, not just as a knee-jerk reaction, well, somebody told me I should do this, so I guess I better, but to choose them on purpose because they work for you. This is Paul Millard. Paul, for the early part of his career, was checking all of the boxes of a conventional life. He got into a good college. He did very well in that college. He landed a job in corporate consulting after he graduated from college in a very high-powered corporate consulting firm, and he did very well there. He was doing all the things he was supposed to, all the things his parents wanted him to do, and he realized that he hated it. And he realized that he really wanted to quit. And so he did. And when he realized he wanted to quit, he realized that his job was sapping his soul so much that he paid back a $20,000 bonus in order to be able to leave. He literally wrote his company a check for $20,000 to give them back money they'd given him when he took the job so that he wouldn't have to stay out the duration of his contract and so that he could leave. He started traveling. He became a nomad. He traveled all over the world. He started writing. He started doing very little else. He was trying as hard as he could not to work at all for a while and figure out what he actually wanted to do. And remember this, we all just want to be happy, successful, we want to make money. Paul met his wife after quitting his job. He was nomading around the world and he was spending time in Taiwan. His wife is from Taiwan. He met her there. They're now married and have a beautiful daughter, and Paul is sustaining all of them in their creative endeavors. His wife is an artist and a writer too, by doing work that is very unconventional, in part by writing books. So Paul wrote this book about his experiences a couple of years into this very unconventional path that he was now taking in his career. And when you write a book, the common advice is that you should get a publisher, you should get an agent, you should get a big publishing deal. But Paul decided to self-publish his book, which people say you shouldn't do because your book will flop if you don't publish through a traditional publishing house. No one will take it seriously. No one will ever buy it. No one will ever see it. But Paul did it anyway. And he published through Amazon, and he started promoting his book on Twitter, and the book did very well. About 2 years after launching the book, it crossed 50,000 sales, which, to give you some context, the average book published in America sells about 500 copies, and a book is considered to have done well if it sells 10,000 copies, and Paul sold 5 times that many by completely breaking from the traditional path that he was supposed to be on. About a year after his book started really taking off and getting viral traction, a publisher reached out to Paul and wanted to talk to him about a book deal. And Paul entertained the conversation and asked lots of questions because he wanted to know, like, maybe this is the right path forward. And eventually he said no to the deal because book deals offer credibility of being published by a big publishing house. They offer distribution. They'll get your book on the shelves in bookstores. They'll market it to larger audiences. And they offer you upfront cash. You'll get an advance for the book that you're selling based on the projection of how many sales they think that you will make. But see this here, this bottom of the tweet that he posted? In 2.5 years, he did $250,000 in book sales and sold 50,000 copies. He was already getting all of the things that he was like a book deal would be offering him. So really all that the book deal was offering him by the time the publisher came along was the chance to sell away the intellectual property rights of his book, which he didn't particularly want to do. Nobody wants to sign those things away to a publisher if they don't have to. So he said no to the book contract. In this story that I just told, Paul broke 2 very significant social rules. The first is that he quit his job, which you're not supposed to do, especially if you're on a successful career path. The second is that he published a book without a publisher, which you're not supposed to do. If you want to publish a book, everyone will tell you, oh, go find an agent, go find a publisher. I Googled this for you. This is what Google had to say. Steps 3 and 4 are about finding an editor, finding an agent, finding a publisher. Full disclosure, this did have a note way down at the bottom, like, oh, by the way, you could also self-publish if you really wanted to. But the primary checklist of advice is to write a book, find an agent, find a publisher, take the traditional path. But Paul didn't, and it worked. We all know at this point what society would think, but Paul did not care. Lots of people step off the path that they're supposed to be on and break the rules at different points in their journey. I'm going to talk about college again, but from a completely different angle. We're going to do a 180 here. This is Pano Canelos. Pano was a respected university professor at St. John's College, which is the college that I had on the very first slide that I had up here, the school that I very seriously considered going to before I decided not to go to college at all. Pano was the president. He was highly respected, highly regarded in that position. And he quit to start a new university. It was called the University of Austin. You may have heard of it. It was backed by people like Barry Weiss and Joe Lonsdale. It got quite a bit of media attention when they released the press release about starting the university in the fall of 2021. The New York Times was not impressed. Is the University of Austin just a PR stunt? Turns out no. They are in the process of launching their inaugural class in the the fall of 2024. The University of Austin was built in defense of free speech. It was built as a response to a lot of the things that were happening on college campuses in the late 2010s and the early 2020s. And it was the first new private university to be launched in the state of Texas in 60 years. People don't usually start universities. This is like, universities exist. Somebody else started them a long time ago. We don't really build new ones. It had been so long since the university had been started in the state of Texas that when the University of Austin submitted the paperwork to become an accredited university, nobody inside of the government knew what to do with the paperwork because nobody was still alive who'd ever done this before. They're like, we'll figure it out and get back to you. This is the Scarborough building where the university is now housed. This is the inside of the building when they were in the process of getting it up and running. The university founders spent 9 months working out of a coffee shop before they even had an office, let alone a campus. They got the university up and running in 2 years. They announced it in the fall of 2021. Almost 2 years to the date, in the fall of 2023, they became an accredited university. They have had thousands of applications for faculty positions. People who work in academia are very excited to put their hats in the ring to get on board with this project. And they're currently in the process of finalizing their first class of 100 students who are starting this fall. You're not supposed to be able to start a new university that quickly, or really at all. And you're definitely not supposed to leave your tenured position inside of academia to go start a new university. Pano had the ultimate job in academia. He was a university president, and he walked away. And University of Austin is arguably going to be one of the most interesting things happening in higher education in this generation. But the only way Pano could find out whether this was a complete mistake or whether this was the greatest choice of his career was to try. So he did. This headline is also really important. I want to talk about this for a minute. So no one defends the rules and the conventions and what you're supposed to do as staunchly as the established academics and intellectuals. There's a reason for this. In large part, it's because they had to follow the rules in order to get to their positions. They followed all the rules and checked all the boxes and did all the right things. And now they have jobs doing this highly venerated work. And the rules benefited them, and they're benefited by other people following the rules, but they're also often wrong about what they even think the rules are. And I want to tell you my favorite story about this. So on October 7th, 1903, a man named Samuel Langley attempted to launch the first flying machine. It was supposed to be man's first flight. This was before the Wright brothers. He invited all of the press to come and see it. and he launched his contraption on the Potomac River. And as you can see, this is the very first photo taken of it, it's already nosediving. It immediately fell into the river, and it promptly sank. Samuel Langley was a professor of astronomy. He worked at the Smithsonian Institute. He had all the right credentials. He had government funding backing the build of his flying machine. And everyone thought if anyone's going to be successful in this endeavor, it's going to be him. And when his flying machine fell into the river, this is the front page of the New York Times 2 days later on October 9th of 1903, the New York Times published this op-ed in which they said, it will take between 1 million and 10 million years for humans to learn how to fly. 69 days later, on October 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers successfully flew their very first prototype of the airplane that was able to become airborne at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. And 66 years after that, which is a very small fraction of a million years, man flew all the way to the moon. The Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville, were not scientists. They did not have government backing. They were not affiliated with the Smithsonian Institute. They were bicycle repairmen. They weren't supposed to be the ones who figured out how to fly. That was supposed to be the venerated academics that solved that lofty problem. And if these two men had taken the New York Times too seriously, they might have said, well, I'm sorry, Wilbur, but the experts say we can't, so I guess we should pack up and find something else to do. But they didn't. And if everyone had believed the New York Times op-ed, we still wouldn't be able to fly because no one would have tried, because a million years is a very, very, very long time, and then so why take a stab at it? The experts are the ones who are going to cry the loudest that the rules must be followed, but sometimes they're wrong. Okay, rule breaking slide again. Sorry, guys. This story of Wilbur and Orville Wright is very interesting in part because it appears to be a rule of nature. It appears that we can't fly because gravity. But it was a rule that could be worked around. And you had to be very enterprising in your thinking about what is possible in order to even take a stab at it, let alone to figure it out. But you don't have to invent the airplane to break things that look like rules but actually aren't. This is me at Level Up in 2022. About 2 months prior to this photo being taken, I met the investor of Renegade Educator, the education media brand that I now run. This investor is one of the biggest investors in the education space. He's backing tons of people who are building innovative education projects, schools, networks of schools, technological programs to go into schools. And he was really interested in the idea of somebody building a media brand around education. And he asked me if that was work that I wanted to do. And I said, yes, I write about this anyway. Of course I want to do this. And he said, okay, would you like me? How do you want to do this? Do you want me to hire you? Do you want to be a contractor? And I said, neither. And I proposed that he came on as a client to the marketing agency that I totally didn't have, but kind of acted like I did, and then totally went to set up the next day. I still don't think he knows that story, actually, don't tell. If I hadn't done that, my business wouldn't exist. I was able to build Renegade Educator and a marketing agency that now serves other clients in the education space doing the same type of work, all at the same time. But that happened because I was willing to propose a third option. I didn't take the two things that he put in front of me as hard and fast rules. I proposed something else. And that something else became the path that we took. None of this I didn't really have dramatic foresight, though, about all of this. I didn't really realize that I was going to be setting up a profitable business when I made this move. It seemed like the right thing to do, but I had no idea how it was going to turn out. I didn't know if he was going to say yes, but I didn't even know if it was going to work for me, even if he did. You don't have to know that you're going to build a business in order to propose something that could lead to that. You don't have to know, okay, well, I'm going to invent flight this year, so it seems like it's probably worth the risk of breaking rules in order to do that. Sometimes you don't really know what's going to come of breaking a rule. And that's not necessary in order to do that. My whole point is to find the things that are true for you and follow them, even if you don't know how it's going to work out, and to be willing to accept the possible risks of what may come of it, but be willing to face them for the possibility of what you might be able to discover or become or achieve. Sometimes the path emerges over time when you do this. This is the late, great Clayton Christensen. He was a professor at Harvard Business School, and he wrote a phenomenal book called How Will You Measure Your Life? And in that book, he talked about two types of career paths. He talked about the deliberate path versus the emergent path. A deliberate life path is one where everything is mapped out. You know exactly where you're going, but you also know every step in the process in order to get there. You know that in 6 months I'm going to do this, in 9 months I'm going to do this, in 3 months in 3 years I'm going to do this. You know all the steps of the process. An emergent life path is one where things become clear over time. You don't always know how it's going to work out. You don't necessarily even know exactly where you're going. You have some plans because life requires that. But you don't know exactly how it's all going to unfold, and you trust the process of getting there. These two things can, of course, go hand in hand. You can have both plans and an openness to emergence, but you don't have to wait to have everything figured out in order to start breaking rules. And backup plans do help. Like I said earlier, when I skipped college, I knew I could always go back. I knew that college would still be there, and that gave me the courage to do the thing, even though it was scary, because I knew the possible repercussions were fixable and were things that I could overcome. So which rules should one break? This is the million-dollar question. The simple answer is whatever one feels right for you. These rules exist for a reason. Social conventions exist for a reason. This is not a bad thing. And some social conventions make sense to follow. It's likely that you're going to want to follow more than not. But not all of them fit you, and you should shed the parts that don't. This is how I often think about my own life and how well I'm doing it, both following and breaking the necessary rules in order to achieve this. We often follow rules for the sake of these things. But sometimes achieving these things also requires breaking rules, and you have to have the discernment to know the difference. And so I'll ask myself if I'm on track for these things, and I'll also ask myself what my definitions of these things even are. What to me is success? What to me is happiness? How do I know if I've attained it? And the whole goal is to attain these things as is true for you, not somebody else's definition. The whole point is to find your own compass. All of this is hard to actually put into practice, and I want to use the time that I have left before we get into Q&A to share one of the processes that I've used to actually do this. This is probably my best piece of practical advice that I could give you for figuring out your own path amidst the rules and which ones you want to dodge and which ones you want to follow. And it's a process called learning out loud. So the idea is that as you're learning things, you're sharing them. It's kind of like a process of breathing in and breathing out. You learn things, and then you talk about them. And then you learn things, and you talk about them. And this might seem a little antithetical at first, because if you're learning about something, who are you to talk about it? It seems like you would need to be an expert in order to share things that you are learning and for that to be useful. We all know what these guys would say about that. But you don't have to be an expert in order to share something valuable. And remember how sometimes the experts are kind of wrong? This is another example from 1972 about how we have 10 years to stop the environmental catastrophe or the world will become uninhabitable. That didn't happen either. It's kind of like some of these things that we think are rules are actually just opinions. Sometimes you have to be willing to accept that that might be the case about some of these things that are touted as fact. And the whole point of learning out loud is to figure out what you think about the world and how you see the world and what matters to you, and then to share what you're learning while you're learning it. And part of that process allows you to figure out what you think about these things by talking about it, by writing about it, by sharing it with other people. You're all at a conference this week. I'm guessing you've all learned something over the course of the past 24 hours that you've been here. You'll certainly learn something over the course of the next couple of days. A week ago, the version of you that lived a week ago, didn't know that thing that you just learned. And someone who is in the same position that you were a week ago would find the thing that you're sharing helpful. So it's not even just about your own learning. Putting things out into the world is helpful for other people too. But it's also a way of distilling your thinking, of clarifying your opinions, and it's a way of building your portfolio over time. This is Dan Sanchez, who's here in the audience as well. Dan, who some of you might know, works at FEE. He's managed the content department at FEE for years. Dan started his career at a museum, and while he was working at a museum, he became fascinated by the ideas of liberty. So he started writing extensively about the things he was learning. He was reading, he was listening to podcasts, and he was writing about the things that he learned, and he started publishing them on a blog. And the editor of Mises.org saw his work and sent him a message and asked if he could start republishing some of his pieces at Mises. And Dan's writing career was born. He has spent almost 2 decades as a commentator in the world of liberty and independence and human flourishing. And he did not go to grad school to become a scholar. He wrote his way into figuring out what his calling was and what work he wanted to do. And he wrote his way into job opportunities and finding a path. By all intents and purposes, Dan also broke the rules. He didn't do what you're supposed to do to become a scholar. And yet he was able to craft a path that perfectly fit the life that he wanted to be living. This is what I did too when I skipped college. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea. I definitely didn't know I was going to be doing this. So I started writing a lot. I went to conferences a lot like this one. I listened to lots of podcast episodes. I talked to lots of people. And I wrote and wrote and wrote about the things that I was learning. I wrote about my startup job in education working at Praxis. I wrote about my education as a homeschooler and about skipping college and about how that path evolved for me. And eventually I started landing work in education because I started building connections with people who were also interested in the same ideas I was. And now for a living, I help convince parents to pull their kids out of public school, which is the ultimate rule breaking. And I found my way to that. I definitely didn't graduate from college and say, okay, my calling in life, or at least in my 20s, is going to be helping parents pull their kids out of public school. I found my way there over the course of years by writing about the things I was interested in and sharing what I was learning. You all have telephones in your pocket. Unlike this one, they have apps on them. You can take notes, you can write, and I would highly, highly encourage you to utilize that power. Start a Twitter account, start tweeting, make Instagram reels of the things that you're learning about, write blog posts, set up a Substack account. And if you aren't sure what to write about, create a how-to about something that you've learned how to do. Write an opinion piece. You're allowed to have an opinion. You don't need a degree in order to qualify you to have an opinion about things. Write anecdotes about experiences that you've had. Of course, you're qualified to talk about your own experiences. They're your experiences. Write summaries of things that you've learned. And over time, as you're doing this, you're going to refine your thinking, including your thinking about whose opinions actually matter to you and whose are just noise, and what rules you do and do not want to follow. Because at the end of the day, your life is about you. It's supposed to be fun. It's not about satisfying somebody else. It's about what you want. Sometimes the things that people want to convince you are rules of nature or rules of morality are just social rules. And sometimes those social rules are just conventions. They're not rules at all. And sometimes they're not even important to get what you want. So break them. Thank you.
Hi, yes, thank you. As one who also decided to skip college, what were some of the sources you used to maintain your conviction in that decision when others were questioning it?
Great question. So like I said, I graduated from high school in 2015. This was kind of before people started writing articles about how to be successful without college. The biggest things that I found when I was Googling what to do besides going to college was this company called Praxis that was helping people land jobs without college degrees. So I started reading their blog. And as I was reading their blog, I was absorbing everything I could about the paths that multiple people on the team had dropped out of college, had taken unconventional paths. And that was honestly, I ended up working for them. So it was a formative resource for me, but it also was one of the biggest things that kind of gave me some bravery around, okay, I'm not the only person who thinks that this is a path that I can take, so maybe I'm going to be okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Hannah.
Hi.
It's good to see you again. I just wanted to share context because I'm from Nepal, and in Nepal, after we complete our 10 degree, society imposed you have to learn science, you have to read biology so that you could have some skills. And I am a biggest rule breaker in my country because I chose a different stream. I am recently studying development studies. So society told me okay, you are just gonna be a housewife and you are not gonna do anything in your life. And when they see me now joining conferences, giving trainings to the people, they say okay, we knew you are going to do this something in your life. So I think it's up to you what you think, what you want to do, and the society's work is okay, they are going to impose something, but it's you who is going to decide your life. So I could relate so much of things with you. So thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. You have to really think about whose opinions actually matter and whose gatekeeping actually has bearing on your path, and it's usually far fewer people than you assume.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi Anna, thank you for the good talk. I'm a big fan of your Twitter account, Rebel Educator. So you mentioned the Montessori training programs, and I'm just curious if you know how these programs manage to not get ideologically captured like rest of the teachers training programs by the critical pedagogists and stuff like that.
Yeah, good question. So I actually know a fair amount about this because I work with some Montessori schools with my agency. So any institution is going to have some, it's going to be colored by the ideologies of the people who are running it. Generally speaking, Montessori is very, very focused on the educational pedagogy. It's a very niche sort of training program. And so the people who run these Montessori training institutions, there's a couple really big ones in the US that most Montessori teachers go through. Their primary interest is just the actual Montessori approach. So a lot of things that would feel like deviations from that aren't terribly relevant. I think the biggest place where something that might be a little more controversial would come up is sort of questions around how do we handle these types of conversations in our classroom or something like that. But I think in large part it's not terribly relevant.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So you mentioned moral rules of morality, and you were mentioning all sorts of other kinds of rules and breaking them. And as I understand it, rules of morality are the rules that you should never break, like your own morality. This is the moral compass in light of you judge social conventions and rules of the society that you live in. And I wonder if you think differently about that. And specifically, you mentioned Martin Luther, and you said something about him breaking moral laws. What did you mean?
So, this is a big question. I generally agree with you that when you have a stance on what is and is not moral, in my mind, that's the most important set of rules to follow. I care far more about what I believe is moral and true than what other people tell me I should believe or should adhere to. So in general, I would say that I agree with the way that you just framed this, that the moral rules are the most important thing, which could be the topic of an entirely separate talk, how to discern those, how to think about that. That's why it's not always clean cut. That's why philosophy is a career path that people can go down. These are big questions. But yeah, in some ways, I think the moral rules are the most important.
Thank you.
Hi. So rule breaking. but not every rule breaker wins, right? I mean, there were
This is
hundreds
true.
of Mark Zuckerbergs, but just one person made it. So whenever we talk about rule breaking, shouldn't we also focus on the risk analysis and the cost efficiency of breaking the norm? So what's the formula that you can suggest to everyone here whenever they're thinking about rule breaking? Yeah.
So I think you have to break down what is the rule that is being proposed to me as being necessary, and what is the cost of following that rule, which sometimes can be quite steep financially or in terms of opportunity cost, your time. And then you have to look at the possible other options and again analyze the potential cost. Like, what is the social fallout that I'll experience if I don't do what I'm supposed to? What are the opportunities that might be closed off to me if I follow a non-traditional path? And then you have to look at those two things side by side and say, okay, which one of these costs am I more willing to bear? Because both are going to have costs. Following rules has costs too. But you also have to pair that with your own sense of, what is the cost of each of these paths to me as a person? Like, what is the cost going to be if I do something that I don't want to do and it saps a little bit of my motivation and my energy away? What is the cost going to be to me if I know deep down that this is the thing that I want, but I'm afraid to do it because I'm afraid of someone else's judgment? And that also has to be part of the equation. So it's not simple, but it's something that you can practice again and again and again. We are faced with possible choices every single day. I'm dressed very traditionally for giving a talk like this. I could have broken the rule. I could have come up here in jeans and cowboy boots if I wanted to. I just like looking this way. It doesn't feel worth the cost. But also, this is costly too. These shoes hurt. This isn't comfortable. So I had to balance the cost. Which cost would I rather pay? Not looking dressed up, but having my feet having my feet be comfortable, or having my feet hurt but getting to look pretty in a dress. You're balancing that all the time, and the more you learn to think that way and see everything as a choice rather than a necessity, the easier and easier it becomes to start to think that way about the big things too.
All right. Thank you.
Good question.
What pitfalls or hurdles would you tell somebody who's planning on breaking rules and quit his job and start a business to look out for? What would be the biggest ones?
Are you starting a business in something in particular?
I'm asking for a friend.
For a friend. Okay. I got you. You can tell your friend that he's very brave and good luck. There's tons, right? And a lot of it for something like this is very personal, because when you're going off the traditional expected path, it's sometimes hard to predict what's going to come at you when you're doing the same things everybody else is doing. You can predict based on the challenges that they run into, what challenges you're going to run into as well. So in some ways, I think wide-ranging reading about this sort of thing can be very beneficial. When you're starting a business, if you're leaving a job, you're not just responsible for the business itself, you're also responsible for being your own boss and making sure you show up at work on time and you're getting everything done that you're supposed to. You have to be your own cheerleader and the employee, and that's tough. There are all kinds of challenges that come up in terms of customer acquisition and making sure that all your expenses are being covered, and if you're managing multiple people, making sure you have enough to make payroll every month. You might get really excited about those challenges. I don't know, but they're things that are very real, and not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, because that can be hard. It can feel very isolating to be somebody who's running a business when all of your friends are complaining about their boss, and you're like, I'd complain about my boss too, but I am. But I think the internet makes a lot of that surmountable because you have such access to information and resources. So honestly, I would lean on that as much as possible.
Thank you.
You can tell your friend he can come talk to me about this later if he likes. Hi.
Hi, Hannah. Good to see you. Thank you for the talk. Breaking rules out loud, posting your work, learning out loud is terrifying at an age where you're not sure if you'll agree with yourself in 2 years, and in an age that catalogs every step you take and may persecute you for literally anything. When do you think you should back down and actually not hit send and maybe not post that, and when do you think you need to face your fears and hit send?
I'm generally pretty careful about things that I know are going to be very controversial. I really triple check to make sure this is a thing I'm willing to stand by later. The internet does retain everything, but also a lot of things people also forget. Like, there's kind of a threshold of significance in like the public discourse that you have to reach for people to start dredging through all of your old tweets to find things that you said 10 years ago and persecute you for it. But I think in general, like, it's always good to do the gut check. It's always good to be aware of it, but it's not like you don't want it to cripple you. You don't want it to be a thing that you're afraid of publishing at all because you're afraid that someday you're going to change your mind. People know that you're going to change your mind about some things. And if you're very clear in the brand that you're building that, you know, you're learning about these things in real time and you're sharing what you're learning, I think the world can be much more forgiving towards that. So I would be very careful around things that you have a sense are going to be very controversial to make sure it's like really a stance you want to take. But for everything else, I would feel pretty free about having the space to change your mind later. And like, you can always write a follow-up piece about why you changed your mind, you know?
Thank you.
Hi. So how do you balance limited resources, such as money, with following a pathless path?
You have to get creative about where the money is going to come from. There's lots of different ways you can do this, right? You can build up a nest egg and then take time, make a savings account that you can then draw on for a while that can sustain you while you're doing something unconventional. You can take an unconventional path in terms of how you're going to make money and then figure out over time whether or not that's sustainable. Again, I think the backup plans is very helpful. So like when I quit my startup job a few years ago and became an entrepreneur, like a freelancer at first, long before the marketing agency existed, I would just like have a backup plan very clear in my own mind of like, okay, like I have some savings that can sustain me for a few months if none of this works, and if I can't make money anymore, like I can cover my rent or I can break my lease. I can always go move in with my parents if I need to. Like I had layers of fallbacks that made it feel a lot easier to take risks. But I also was prioritizing my time around like, okay, I have to make money, I have to sustain myself somehow, so the work that I'm going to do is going to be constrained by that in some way. I'm going to figure out how to monetize some of this. So I think you just kind of have to balance how you're thinking about it around like what your actual needs are and then structure your endeavors accordingly.
Thank you.
Hannah, you mentioned that school is largely about teaching thoughtless rule following. It also does a lot of indoctrination against liberty. You recently emceed a student conference called Active Minds that was put on by the Foundation for Economic Education in partnership with the Prometheus Foundation. And you inspired many young people as to think actively about their own lives and about free societies. What are some principles that you believe in how to do that?
Ooh, how to help kids like feel a sense of their own liberty and freedom and a value of it. Well, this is why I try to talk parents into pulling their kids out of public school for a living. That's a pretty good start. I think a lot of it's exposure and a lot of it's culture. You know, when you're this is such a big question. When you're raising kids, you're raising them inside of like a society that has values and norms and things that are easy and things that are hard, but you're also raising them inside of a like social, like that's the society of your home and the culture there. And I think a lot of those things really shape a child's perspective of the world around them and how it operates. Like I'm very, very pro entrepreneurship for kids, especially little kids. Like the classic lemonade stand is such a beautiful phenomenon, but there's so many different versions of this. Kids do handmade crafts and sell them online. Kids do all sorts of like entrepreneurial, like I'm gonna start a car cleaning business and service everybody in my neighborhood and like make some pocket money that way. And those types of things I think give kids a really strong sense of autonomy and individuality and competence from a very early age. And I think the more of that you instill early, and by instill I really mean because it's not, you know, about filling the kids' heads with ideas, it's about exposing them to possibilities and allowing them to develop their own perspectives of things over time. But the more you expose them to these things being possible as ways that the world functions, I think the more of a strong sense of individual autonomy they're going to have, an individual competence, and the more they feel a sense of that competence, the more they're going to value their own liberty to pursue that competence in ways that are meaningful to them. And then as they get older and they become more intellectually curious, then exposing them to the big ideas and exposing them to books and conferences like this and talks and events that will challenge them to actually grapple with the philosophical side of this. But I think the practical grounding is also like one of the really important, like from an early age, is one of the things that gives all of that context to then be built upon.
Thank you. Wonderful talk.
Thank you, everybody.